Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming, and I think everybody's found a seat. Look, I just want to thank you all very much for coming this evening, and this is the first of the Addison Lee panel events, so we're hoping to encourage lots more discussion as a team with you guys and with more people over time around some of the things that are important to our passengers and to our customers. We're globalising our proposition, as many of you know, and some of the big pictures and some of the big challenges that are influencing the travel industry generally are starting to become very important to our passengers. And really our ambition is to start to bring these forward to you and to start kind of creating the dialogue and having the conversation around the implications of the kind of the globalized world. For today, we've been working in partnership with our customers and with other professionals from the travel industry and many of the industry bodies to try and bring the issues associated with the globalization agenda to the front so we can have the conversation and start to have the dialogue. We have actually put some effort into creating a white paper, which we're pretty excited about, and a lot of the people in the room and beyond the room have contributed to what we're trying to achieve in the white paper conversation. And what I wanted to do just before we start the panel conversation was to give you some insight into some of the things we've learned from the conversations we've had and from the engagements we've had with our customers that have informed our white paper, and I suspect with many of the things we talk about in the panel conversation later. And I'm delighted that we have some of the greatest experts in the space to talk about some of those things a little later on. So first off, I just wanted to talk about global travel policy. And really, why is safety becoming so important to us and to customers and to really anybody who's traveling? And as we can see, what we're talking about here is an industry that's growing really quite strongly. The amount of business travel, and we all know this intimately, that's going to happen over the next 12 months and into the future is growing really very, very hard. And I think because of that, there are lots more implications that we need to manage and lots more of the issues that we need to address together as an industry. Today's employees are working with their clients very much in a global context. I think that the amount of information, the amount of data, the way that people are working together is driving a different type of accelerated speed in the way that we make decisions, but relationships are still key. And relationships for many people are key in parts of the world they won't necessarily be familiar with. So as employees are having to travel to more diverse places in different circumstances and at different stages in a relationship, that raises lots of questions and new challenges around health and safety, duty of care, and some of the more broader issues around how do you manage that on behalf of travelers. And I think that we also know that travelers themselves are becoming increasingly aware of, sadly, terror attacks and other dangers around travel. And that, you know, that's partly a perception point, that's partly to do with the media, part of the way that we're working globally, but there's also a reality around understanding what's happening in the world environment when you travel. And because of those perceptions and those realities, I think it's fair to say that employers and people who are accountable are starting to become increasingly aware and familiar with what duty of care really means, and really the kind of legal implications as well, to be frank. So there's a moral and a legal obligation that employers have. And what we're learning from our customers is that, frankly, a lot of employers are really at a loss when the worst happens. And I think that together we've got to quite quickly accelerate the right sort of solutions and the right behaviours to support global travellers. So look, you know, why are we talking about it here tonight, and what does Addison Lee have anything to do with this? Addison Lee's always been very passionate about safety, about personal safety, about corporate safety. It's really been the bedrock of how we've developed our business. And we've changed the industry in a different way from others. by providing that kind of safe and consistent experience for all major customers of ours and all the travel destinations around the world that we are responsible for. And many of you will be familiar with the Addison Lee brand here in London, but also globally the TriStar brand and the services that we've been providing for a long, long time for global travellers. And really the standards that we encompass, that what we do as a team for our customers and corporately goes way beyond the scope of just the ground transportation, but also into the standards that encompass all of global travel. And so for our white paper, the ambition that we had was to bring together, you know, the 10 experts from a much broader field than just talking about ground, but talking about the wider implications of what it means to have the same sort of commitment and focus on travel security and travel safety. So in 2016, as we started this journey as a global group working with our clients, we started to do some research about what is actually really important to our customers, what really matters in terms of business travelers and from a safety perspective. And what we discovered was that because of what people demand and because of what they need and because of the environment they're working in, that actually employers need to really change their approach. So with globalization, with businesses working in really much more far-flung destinations than they have done historically, there is an increased need for that duty of care, which passengers and employees are demanding. People feel vulnerable when they're traveling outside their comfort zone. And as a result, what we're hearing from the research is that travelers are demanding not just reliable and easy transport, but also services that have a familiar sense of security. So are familiar to them and similar to the experiences they have in their home market. And because of this, we see several employer challenges, which I think are really quite important and kind of start to get to the heart of hopefully the conversation we're going to have in a little bit. So look, there is an obligation on employers. So as they do more business globally, they've got to provide safe, comfortable, and proactive travel experiences for their passengers and for their travelers. Equally, businesses have to start to recognize that with the media being what it is and the transmission of data across the world being what it is, that to make sure that they get that information in front of their travelers in real time to help them make the right decisions in the moment. You can't dictate all of those decisions as you could in the old days. You've got to give people the information to start making their own decision as they're traveling. And I think particularly for this industry, and I think this is very familiar for all of us, is the impact of technology. So we just talked about data and the impact of the real-time availability of information globally, the real-time ability to make decisions. And on the back of that, travelers need to have the ability to make transport decisions in the palm of the hand. They already have it. So when you take that ease of use and that ability to make decisions instantaneously, how can you track and trace the decisions that people are making because of the other side of the coin, which is the obligations that everybody has to ensure safety and security. And because of that empowering technology, we really are starting to see that the use of apps, and for want of a better phrase, but really the use of making decisions in the moment is really one of the key drivers behind the obligations of the employer, but also if you don't get it right, the other consequences behind employees and travelers making road decisions that go outside policy if you don't manage it properly. And for corporates, as responsibility increases, as visibility increases, that makes it much more difficult to sustain control and visibility at the heart of the kind of business management, business policy process. So the only way to sort of reconcile those two sort of contrary notions is to make sure that you start to build the apps and start to build that digital interface, start to build that instantaneous sharing of information right at the heart of the way that you work with employees and the way you work with travelers globally. I think additionally, when we talk about uncertainty and disaster, and sadly terror attacks mean that this goes much beyond war zones. It's not going to be obvious where people are traveling to, where there may be a challenge, and you certainly need to carry on doing business where we know that sadly these circumstances are all too real. and sadly we've seen very many instances of those in very popular business destinations and leisure destinations. So what we're finding from our research is there's quite big gaps in the knowledge of what really matters to people in those moments, and what it is that employers are responsible for, and what it looks like from a insurance and indemnity perspective. So people make assumptions around insurance cover that may not actually be accurate. And I think that what we've also learned is that very few employers have actually, when they look at the way that their employees travel and the way that the business is changing, have actually gone in to explore and experiment with scenarios where they're very challenged about these circumstances and what happens when they face an emergency situation, not just in the locations they may traditionally expect, but really anywhere where you may be doing business. So what we're saying is, whilst we come from a pedigree of very strong duty of care and very strong safety, to make this work and to make this work as a team, we have to work in partnership, and as I said earlier, we have to extend the remit of what we do way beyond just the impact of ground transportation. So because of this, we think that it's incredibly important that employers start to build that partner ecosystem, and that Addison Lee want to be at the heart and at the forefront of what it looks like, bringing partners together to make travel policies real. And I think that because of that, corporates and employers need to start demanding a lot more of their travel suppliers, and they need to not only look at people like us for advice, but look for consistent advice and look for consistent propositions that make sense given those wider challenges. So there is a demand here, there is a requirement here to be very, very demanding of your providers to satisfy those broader safety challenges that we spoke about at the start. So I think given that, and given that introduction, I wanted to get the panel together to talk about the issues behind the research we've done, the issues as employers, the issues as travel industry professionals as we embark on this next stage. So we think about what we've spoken about, what we've learnt, that people have real-time information, real-time ability to make decisions, which is incredibly empowering, but needs to be linked to those obligations and those challenges that we have as employers and travellers to make sure that we keep ourselves safe in what is a very changing global environment. So I'm going to open up the discussion. We're very, very proud to have a very strong panel, to have a very good discussion. It requires everybody to have a discussion. It's not a one-way thing. So we're going to have a discussion now, but we want some Q&A. We want some genuine good engagement from the team here as we talk about some of the implications of some of the things that we've spoken about. So if I may open up the floor and ask the panel please to come and join us at the front. Great. So before we start, what I'd like to do is to ask the panel to introduce themselves to the audience. Richard.
So I'm Richard Magnus, one of the owners and founders of Northcote Global Solutions, and we are an emergency assistance and crisis management company that specialises in the point of incident, no matter the problem globally.
Hi, good evening. I'm Adrian Parks. I'm CEO of the GTMC. The GTMC is the representative body of all travel management companies in the UK.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Ian Cohen, and I'm the Group CIO at Addison Lee. And I'm responsible for pretty much everything we do in technology, from the apps and web services we deliver to our customers and our drivers, right the way through to the infrastructure we deliver those over.
Hello everyone, I'm Caroline Strachan. I'm sat on the middle seat right with that in my eye. So if I'm making zero eye contact, that's why. Managing partner at Festive Road, we're a consultancy working across the travel value chain. I do a lot of work with the buyer community, so traveller safety is really key. My background, 20 years in business travel, 10 years as supplier, 10 years the buyer at Yahoo, AstraZeneca, Cisco, so that's where some of my opinion might come from. And also 2 years heading up the global consulting group at Amex.
My name's Antoine Bourret. I'm the CIO of Hillgate Travel. I'm only 4 years into travel, 20 years in IT for companies like Dell, Oracle. and others. So I think what I'm going to bring to the conversation is not just my perspective as a CIO in a TMC, but that of having traveled for 20 years in global roles and trying to reconcile the two and saying, well, do we do it well, and what can we do better as an industry and specifically as a company?
Good evening, everybody. My name's Clive Ratton. I'm the CEO of CTI, which is a travel partnership company based in Manchester. Prior to doing this for 2.5 years, was running Etihad Airways in the UK as general manager, and under that, where my ground transportation interest came in, because we did anything up to about 5,000 transfers for our guests each month for first and business class. So got a little bit of knowledge. Might be a dangerous thing, but
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think that what we touched on just a moment ago is that that business travel is increasing. There's much more requirement, much more demand for this moving forward. We know that because of the ability of data to be shared in real time, there's a much greater awareness of terror attacks and sadly the natural disasters that we deal with. And consequently, employers are facing into an environment of a greater requirement to understand duty of care. So with that sort of context, I think I'm going to ask a question of everybody in the panel. I'm going to start with you, Richard, if I may. And the question is,
No pressure.
why global travel safety, and why now?
I think global travel safety and the risk has either increased, or the perception of it has certainly increased. As a company, we set the business up 8 years ago, specialising in the point of incident response for political incidents, security, natural disaster, kidnap and ransom. And in our early years, we were very much viewed as, for companies that only go to Afghanistan, or companies that only go to sort of Nigeria, Africa, etc. But actually, in the last few years, given the events we've seen in Paris, Brussels, London, actually corporates are realising that the traditional assistance model, which is sort of found on most insurance policies, is very much designed as a medical solution coming to an airport, and that isn't really fit for purpose for actually the risk that global travellers face. So we had clients when the Westminster attack occurred, for example. Some guy was in a meeting in Parliament Square. Not that the threat was huge, but they were concerned on their trip. So in that sort of incident, we sorted out literally a vehicle to take him straight to the airport. And then we provided security. RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, they had offices in Parliament Square. So for them, we provided security to guard their building for like a few hours. So I guess the risk is ever increasing, and people are seeing much more risk closer to home, which is probably why global safe travel is becoming more pertinent, because people are hearing and seeing about it more.
Great, thank you.
Same question.
Yes, exactly the same question.
Very well.
So
wait till he gets down here.
Perfect answer. Well done.
So glad I didn't take that in seat.
I think in addition to what you've said, and obviously there's heightened sort of media noise around every unfortunate event that takes place on a global scale, whether it's a terrorist activity or it's what happened in the USA last week from just the shootings that took place. But I also think because of the amount of travel and the amount of infrastructure issues we've got, the whole disruption within travel as well is a really important part of duty of care and management of that duty of care, and how we go about looking after people's well-being and looking after people's productivity as well. So I think productivity is a big issue within travel now as well, around the expectation of a corporate and what its demands are on an individual to travel. I think there's also been a social environment as well in terms of change, and why now at this particular point in time. I think there's a younger generation obviously coming through of travellers, have different demands, and probably those of us that towed the corporate line a lot more than potentially people coming through now into sort of middle and senior management are prepared to do, and they want different things out of when they're travelling for the company. So maybe they want to actually not have to get up at 4 in the morning and turn up and be expected to perform on their A game at 9 o'clock in the morning. They'd rather go the night before and have a decent night's sleep, as if they were taking part in some kind of sport. It's being on your A game productivity-wise, I think, is beginning to change people's attitudes towards travel and towards well-being. And then finally, I think there's a social element where there's a consciousness about demanding on your people being away from home and how long they're away from home as well.
Great, thank you. A couple of very interesting points there. Ian, same question to you.
Well, I think expectation is reality. It doesn't actually matter whether the threat is a real threat or perceived threat. You're going to feel a certain way, and we have to respond in a certain way. I I take the point about the younger generation, but I'm not of that generation.
Really?
You can tell by the haircut. But I was the guy who got given the laminated card to use when I got off the plane and looked at it and wondered what it was and put it in my wallet and hoped I'd never need it. So the world's shifted. Yeah, my universal device that tells everybody where I am is in my pocket all the time. And I have a set of expectations, as do most travellers now, about what we should be able to do with the technology, how we should be able to interact with it, and what it should do for us. And I think that's driving the agenda as well.
Thanks, Ian. And Caroline, what's coming across here now is the reason for now is much to do with technology and so on and so forth. Same question to you, really. Why now for global safety?
The only thing I would say differently from the threat perspective is that over the last couple of years, sadly, it's shifted to major business destinations. So I look at the Vegas shooting recently and think, in my Cisco days, I ran hundreds of meetings in Vegas. And that, if anyone's been to Vegas, it's constant churning of conferences, conventions. There's heaps of business travel into Vegas. So I think the best way I've heard this described is that you now need to be prepared for what you can't prepare for. And that's a really different way of thinking about traveller safety. And in my days as a buyer and now consulting to the buyer community, I think it's shifted. So what I would have had as a very concrete plan as a buyer doesn't really cut it anymore. So that's the only thing I would add on the threat perspective. And then the other bit I would pick out from your introduction around employer obligation, I would guide our clients to, you have a real opportunity to shine and take your responsibility beyond obligation. So picking out the Vegas issue as a dreadful situation as an example, EY had an employee that was affected, was in hospital. They flew someone from EY HR who was at the hospital the whole time, was the liaison with the family. Anything that family needed, they were there and supported them, like way above and beyond you would ever expect an employer to do. Somehow the press picked up on that. EY got amazing coverage from it. It's not why EY do it. I know the EY team very well. They do it because they're an incredibly responsible employer, but they really want to stand out as we go above and beyond for our people because our people are our product. So we see that a lot more with professional services firms. When your people are your product, law firms, consulting firms, etc., they seem to take the lead in any traveller safety initiative.
That's great, thank you. Another new perspective.
No pressure, guys.
Yeah.
Running out of perspectives, positive perspectives. No, I suppose if I look at the last 5 years and I look at what's different, and I've been in this industry now for just about 4, and what is different is there's an emergence of a role, the CSO, and that emergence of a role creates a discipline, and that discipline creates demands. And that then has translated into a lot of system requirements. And so we're finding ourselves now, about 4 years ago when I joined, I did a one-off one where we mapped certain countries, and then we mapped knowledge of those countries and certification against those countries with those travelers. And if they were traveling to a country where they didn't have the certification level, then they would have to recertify online, so forth. I thought that was a one-off. The reality is I'm seeing that more and more and more often.
Right.
So I see a whole new category of systems emerging. I see a whole new, and all driven, as I said, by the emergence of this new function that's embodied by an individual called the CSO. So I do think that has changed tremendously. I think specifically with ground transportation, if you tried to manage ground transportation 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was like grabbing at water. The fragmentation meant that it was very difficult. Now that you have global entities, such as yours and others, you can now actually you're in the first time in a position to actually be able to try to put your hands around the problem, try to solve the problem, try to create policy for the problem, which was really impossible up until that point. So that I'd say those are the 3 things I would say, is that emergence of that role, which drives new demands, which has new solutions, and then also that change around a category which you couldn't put your arms around before, which you can do now. I think those are the kind of 3 things.
Yeah, very interesting, thank you. Clive?
The bar?
Yeah. New perspective here.
No, but I kind of, from a slightly different view, the market that my organisation works in is what be deemed as the SME market, which, as we know, the general report is the fastest growing area for in terms of the UK business sector, and that's a sector that, not like the EYs who have a great robust program around duty of care, it has never been on top of the agenda before, and we deal with a lot of startups by the very nature of the way the business is changing, who it's way off their radar at the moment, and that's why it's so important that it does, because it's not just about security in points of where you're the destination you're going to. There are things like cyber security that the generation and the demographic of those people that are in all those organisations are much younger, that are actually putting themselves at risk by what they do online, not necessarily by actually being somewhere. So that's another area that has kind of really risen up to the point, and I think the other part of that is the changing in the demographic of the traveller. The sheer increase in the number of female travellers that will make up the travelling community means that it needs to be looked at a different way. Yeah. There are market and segments within the market that have changed the direction of it. But I think key for me is that seeing smaller businesses who not even considered really security, and people, the employees they have, tend to be more maverick, and if they're going somewhere for a meeting, they'll stay on afterwards, maybe take in something on a leisure basis, and that how do you know where they are at that time? Yeah. Is it still a responsibility? And all companies, I feel personally, until that individual returns, it's the responsibility of an organisation to make sure that their people are safe. So it's broadened the whole scope.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So that's great. Thank you.
Got away with that.
So look, I think actually really good different perspectives, and I think we're going to pick up on some of those themes as we work through some of the more detailed questions. I think moving forward in terms of the perception of travel safety, I think that Caroline, in the white paper, you're quoted as saying that there's always a safety element to business travel now versus 10 years ago, which kind of begs the questions, which is, how do you think the conversations around travel safety have changed over the last 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So I think the Corporate Manslaughter Act came in, was it 2008, around that time? I was the ITM chairman at the time, the trade body for travel managers, and it rocketed. I was a buyer as well, and I was so fearful of I was going to end up in jail because I hadn't done something in my program. That's how it sort of got positioned in the beginning. So there were a lot of travel buyers, and I was one of them, running scared at the time of, oh my God, like I need to do something quick here, and I don't think the press particularly helped that. And then that settled down, but it made sense. So yes, it was scaremongering, but it made complete sense. As a responsible employer, you would put in good duty of care practices, and then companies, no doubt like your own, really came to the forefront and said, absolutely, yes, we can be there to help you. So I've seen at that point, all mid to big companies, I would say, started to embrace duty of care. If I look at the companies that I work with now, and in addition to what we've all just spoken about, it just feels like a given. Now, I mainly work with mid to large size companies, so I'd be really interested to hear what Clive thinks from a small to medium. Every time we go in and we do strategy work with them, the base question we always start with, and it's a really interesting one for you to think about for your own companies actually, is what's more important to you, the money or your people? Now, it's a trick question, right? Because you're immediately going to go, well, of course, the people. And as soon as you say that, if you think, it depends what role you've got in your company, but you're immediately going to go, hang on a minute, because the money is important as well. And unless you are the CEO of an organisation or the owner of an organisation, you're not able to answer that question. And what we find when we work with these mid to big companies, they don't have a standard answer. No one can answer which is more important. Now, ultimately, in every company, it's just a balance, right? There are some companies who are going to invest a load more than others that are on lower margins. But where we always think travel strategy needs to start from is understanding that balance, because until you understand that balance, whether it's there or there or there, you can't then build the right program moving forwards. Yeah. And I was with a CEO of a very big law firm recently, and he almost laughed me out the room and said, like, why would you even ask me that question? Because it's fundamental, and unless we know the answer to that question, then we can't build the program correctly. And he just looked me dead in the eye. I was like, well, of course it's the employee. And I said, okay, do we want to talk about cost? And he went, I'll talk about cost, but at what cost? If I lose a lawyer, or if a lawyer's unproductive, to pick your point up, or if a lawyer gets injured, or just think of that issue for me when my lawyers are my business. I have nothing unless I have my lawyers, which I thought was such an amazing point to hear right from the top. But his leaders couldn't articulate that. So it was a really important something like, okay, now we know where we're starting from. What we build out as a travel program and a traveller safety program, all is going to stem from that very strong guidance. I wouldn't say I get that stronger guidance from lots of other CEOs I spend time with, but we push them to make sure that we know where that balance sits.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. Going back to your earlier example of EY and then a lawyer, it's very people-based services, and you say you talk to mainly mid and larger companies. I think in a moment, Clive, I'm going to talk to you about kind of the broader business space and this question in the context of SMEs. I'm kind of interested, Antoine, to ask you the same question, because you're new to the industry, and before you came into the industry, you were a knowledge worker using the services and a traveller. So do you sense the same that Caroline's saying around the change in the way that safety has become part of that whole conversation versus 5-10 years ago?
I'd even go back as far as 20 years ago. I think it's more acute, and there is a lot more awareness. I think there is a perception from employees that it's more real. I also think that a lot of the travel in the past was done by a concentrated number of individuals who, by virtue of traveling a lot, gained their own best practices in terms of being able to travel safely. And I think that the need to have that support from the organization was probably not as strong as now, where you have to cater for a very broad-based traveler community, which can be from the intermittent traveler, once a year, to the individual who's going to go only ever once, probably, to that manufacturing facility in Malaysia or wherever it may be at that point in time. So I think the nature's changed, and because the nature's changed, the people, the relationship and the onus has changed. Before, the onus is very much on, you travel a lot, it is your job, you're going to learn it, right? And then there was almost a certain pride in knowing your own best practice, to one now where, because of the not ad hoc nature, but because of the nature of the fact that it could be anybody, because of the greater perception of imminence of the risk, because the fact that the risk is not always abroad, the risk can be here. You could travel to Manchester, just to name one place, and something can happen. All of those different factors mean that now the onus is back on the company instead of the individual. So yeah, it has changed.
Yeah.
In my view, in terms of who's got to own that.
Yeah, and I think that's broadening up the discussion, based on the research at the start about who's travelling now. It's very different. I think that's a really interesting, very interesting perspective. So, I think, Clive, I'm going to open up the question from a different perspective. So you mentioned SMEs and smaller companies at the start, and I think just to remind ourselves the question, how have travel conversations changed for those organisations in the last 5 years or so?
Well, they've changed, but they're still some way behind some of the larger companies, because by the very nature, it's not as far up the agenda. You have to ramp it up the agenda. And to your point, what is the biggest asset of any company, particularly in a startup or a company where there may be 70 employees? The biggest asset is the employee. It doesn't matter what size, but particularly in that area. And you ask the question, well, what do you do about traveller safety? And it's like, well, I hadn't thought about it. And you go, well, you've got CCTV looking after these laptops. You've got an alarm system looking after the building, and yet you're saying your biggest asset is your employees, who you're sending off without any kind of knowledge about what's happening to their safety and security. So, you are concerned about safety and security, but you may be slightly misplacing the importance of what the biggest asset is to protect. But of course, all of it needs to be protected. So, we introduced that concept to say you really do need to think about the whole area of looking after your employees, because it's a lot more expensive, for want of a better phrase, to replace an employee than it is to replace a laptop. And I think it becomes a realization of to them that that's an important part of that, and it doesn't need to write a huge travel policy. It is just about then getting control and giving guidance. And what we tend to say is mitigate, don't suffocate. In a small organisation, because it allows you to make sure people are buying into the concept that you support them for their security, and likewise you're getting best value out of them. And sorry, just finally, I think Adrian made the point, it's not just about security, it's about well-being as well, which is hugely important. Health and well-being is a real key part of this moving forward too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, on that point, Adrian, have you got a context of that the last 5 years, how that conversation's changed?
I think the agenda's changed quite a lot on that particular front. I think it was probably before the act that Caroline mentioned came in, Manslaughter Act came in. I think cost was the driver for a lot of businesses, and I think that has switched now. And as part of the dialogue, well-being has come back on the agenda, and I think performance and productivity is linked to that well-being agenda. And it is slightly crazy to expect somebody to go and win a huge contract for a business that could give them fantastic return for the sake of a 500 quid night, a couple of nights away, or the return on investment of potentially going somewhere and winning a piece of business, saving a piece of business, whatever the job is that needs doing, was not part of that value proposition. And I think getting it back into the value proposition the whole way through, ground transportation all the way through, is just so important if you want your people to perform, if you want them to be on their A game. We've all done it. You've all got up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. You've not slept because you've got to get up early, and you are just knackered when you get there to perform, and you don't win the business. So it's a complete waste of the day anyway. It's a complete waste of the travel spend where you could have prepared much better. Take sports people these days. It's the same agenda. What was in the sports arena 25 years ago, they didn't prepare in the way they do now. They prepare now because they want to win. Most businesses are in that same environment. You want to win, so prepare your people to win.
Yeah, thank you. And Ian, I'm going to open it to you as well, because I think there's a point here that's been made around how we protect information assets. We haven't necessarily extended that to people, and we think the conversation's changing. Are you seeing a convergence of those sorts of ideas?
I am seeing the convergence, but I think that the bit that kind of knits the two together is that there was I mean, I love the whole be on your A game, because it used to be almost a luxury thing. The senior person in the company would go on the business trip and would get the chauffeur at the other end, and everybody else would travel in coach. Now, I mean, I'm on the board of a couple of startups. They are sub 100 seat companies. If God forbid something happened to them, you're talking about perish the thought, the individual event, but the business impact. So the need to create seamless and engaged and safe and trusted ground transportation as a whole is a conversation to be had as a whole. It's not for the executive in Morgan Stanley and not for the startup in Shoreditch, because the people in the startup in Shoreditch are travelling to countries that they've never done before. They're engaging with suppliers, they're building new relationships, they're developing product and services in locations they've never been to before. So the landscape is changing across the board. And so the obligation to provide that safe, secure, trusted, end-to-end end-to-end solution for travel is more pressing now than it's ever been.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think, Richard, I've always been taught not to make any assumptions, but given your role in this space, I'm assuming that you're seeing a lot of change.
I think the thing we're seeing the most is that people used to sort of have one fixed program, and they're looking for a much more multi-dimensional, multifaceted level of support effectively for their travellers. It used to be all right sort of 5 years ago speaking to a company, we've got an insurance policy that covers our people if they fall sick. And that was pretty much it. But since then, it's come on leaps and bounds for a huge amount of levels of support. One thing I always say to our clients is, look, an insurance policy is great, and the cover's great, but insurance is very much a reactive product. If the problem happens, then it will pay for the solution. That's great for an emergency if you're on holiday in Malaga, because no prior planning is required. You can be picked up by an ambulance, taken to a hospital. The issues that we see and what we talk to our clients about is insurance is great for the reactive side to pay if there's a claim, but realistically, you never want to have to pay a claim. You never want to have to be in that position. So what companies need is a much more proactive element supporting their insurance program, being the travel tracker, the country advisories, the risk assessments, the pre-risk reports, tracking your people. So you as a company are doing everything you can to avoid ever having to effectively trigger your insurance policy. And that's what we're seeing, is companies are looking at much more I guess I said, multifaceted solutions than just, oh yeah, we've got insurance.
Thanks so much for that. And I think, Antoine, one of the things that you mentioned was around the fact that there are so many other people travelling, which I think has been picked up by everybody else here. It's a very different environment to what it used to be. In the white paper, you mentioned that you've seen a lot of changes in the way paperwork and consent happen these days, which is really important when you think about a much wider traveller community. And do you see those things impacting the way travel safety is considered?
Well, that particular reference in the paper was about these systems that seem to be evolving, and what I'm saying is a lot of. I suppose there's three parts to it. The first part is accountability, or permission, seeking permission from the traveller to say that if I travel, you are now sufficiently prepared to be able to go on that. So it's kind of that seeking permission or seeking authority, and the auditability around that. The second bit is, okay, we're putting two things together. We're putting a traveller who has whatever that degree of knowledge is. Some people have formalized that. So effectively you can go onto an online course, and if you only travel in so-called level 1, you get this awareness training. If you go to level 2, then you have this, and that then enables you to go to level 1 countries or level 2 countries. So we're seeing a lot of online training coming out in that. So there's this kind of auditability, permission-seeking bit. There's this training awareness bit that's happening, and then the third component is just having that information to see where there's a mismatch between the two, and trying to resolve that in time, ahead of the event, so that the individual who goes out, as you were saying, Adrian, is on their A game. On their A game, not only just professionally, but on their A game in terms of their awareness of the environment that they're going to enter into.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing those three kind of things going at the moment.
Yeah. No, and it talks to the emphasis between the employer versus the employee and who's responsible. And
I'll be honest. I think no employer at the moment would think that it's not their responsibility to do that. The question is whether you take. And I think it's a little bit back to your point, where do you place the emphasis? Is the emphasis more on the paperwork and auditability? Has he signed the paper? Has he given me the release form? He or she, by the way, it could be anyone.
Good,
such that I know, he, she, and if can they? Is there comeback? Have I signed all my? Or the ones that take it even that bit further, that say, not only do I want to do that, but I actually want to prepare them correctly. And you do. It is that. It is exactly what you said. It's and what you see in terms of the requirements reflects the positioning of where they are on that scale.
And I think the best practice here is getting the balance between what you've just described and what you described as suffocation versus
mitigation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because I've been in some situations either as a buyer or in front of a client where an issue comes up. So I've been the travel buyer in a company before where we very sadly lost 4 people in China to a road traffic accident. And so the immediate knee-jerk response to that was almost, let's just not use ground transport in China. Right, so how are they going to get from the airport? Like, what? So right, they're going to go by train. Yeah, but the train could crash. Right, okay, so just being incredibly pragmatic, and it depends on the individuals you've got. The risk is there, it's ever present. So how do you create an environment where your business can still thrive, and you can create an environment in which they can still sensibly travel?
Yeah.
So what we got to, or in fact what the health and safety group got to in that situation was, none of them were wearing seatbelts, so we're going to have a policy that mandates the use of seatbelts in the back of cars.
Yeah.
Good luck with that one, right? So that's not practical. So they came to me, they'd created the policy, and they came to me and said, right, okay, it's your job to now go communicate that. Well, like, I'm a grown adult, all of our travellers are grown adults. You can tell them we would prefer them to wear seatbelts in the back, but at the end of the day, it's still their choice. And if they happen to get into a non-recognised, non-contracted ground transport provider in China, guess what? There won't be any in the back, because local taxis don't have them in the back. So there is that real need for this pragmatic approach, and I've worked with some amazing security people who just get it, and they're so wonderful to work with, because they say, I want to protect our 64,000th employee, that's what I'm going for, but I realise I have to work back from that.
Yeah.
Versus those who just, it's not on their agenda, their security concern is the front door of the office building or the CCTV. So it's how do you find that middle place that allows the business to thrive but protects the employee?
Permit me to jump in on this
Yeah.
one. There is an underlying assumption in everything that we've said, that there's a common understanding, common definition of what the word risk means.
Right.
And I think that's, to some extent, incorrect. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if I look at some of our businesses who are in, for example, in a retail industry, who are typically just visiting shops, typically in relatively confined geographic, that's one thing. We also have, and from my own personal experience of having worked in the oil industry, going on a rig in the middle of a desert is nothing like, going and visiting a shop, up in, I don't know, Sheffield or Preston or whatever. And however, in the oil industry, going on a rig in Saudi Arabia, which was one of the areas that I went to, was actually not considered particularly risky.
Right.
But if I'd taken that same person who was here and put him into that environment, that might have been considered extremely risky. So
Just
I
say,
think
coming from Sheffield, it's not risky.
I don't know. I'm coming from West London. There again, it's a different perception. Yes, so I do think there's this. We can't work on the basis that there is a normalized universal definition of risk. It's really the activity of the individual that defines what's risk. I mean, we have one particular customer at the moment who works only in Africa. For them, many of the countries that I personally would consider places that I wouldn't go to are considered quite normal. They're in their so-called level 1 countries. Their level 3 countries are seriously dangerous type places. So it's the activity of the individual, and and that defines that policy, or enhances it. So it's bidimensional, if you will. If you had if you were doing an MBA, you'd have a 4x4 or 2x2, and you'd have, the importance of the individual and where that, and the nature and the definition of risk.
And I think that's what's hard. I think that's what's hard to the travel buyer, because at the end of the day, your travellers are grown-ups. So telling them what to do when they go to Paris doesn't feel right. Yet that might be the most risky situation for them to be in, because, and the security people I've worked with over the years would say, and I'm sure you're probably much better at this than I am, but you have your guard down when you head to Paris. So you're either feeling like you're in a holiday location, or you just feel it's like London, so you just carry on operating the same as Brussels or Munich or wherever. So your guard is down. And actually the highest number of issues we had, because I think we've talked about disruption and like big security risk, but there's a whole load of other stuff that goes on in between, like having your wallet stolen or breaking your ankle. They're the majority of things that happen to people. Getting arrested. That's a big one in Vegas. I used to have about 50 per trip in Vegas.
No personal experience of this, but no, it's just...
So that's the bulk of what you deal with. It's not the sort of glamorized stuff you talk about with the armoured vehicles and the cashed across the border and all that stuff. It's the day-to-day. I've lost my wallet, I've broken my ankle, I've ended up in hospital, all of those things that happen. That's actually the reality of, I think, what you're dealing with.
That's what we see for quite a lot of our clients, that actually, 80%, 90% of what we do, and 80% of their sort of daily exposure is the basic medical incident. So whilst the sort of these security emergencies are very few and far between, what clients are recognising is actually for them, that's where their duty of care and corporate liability has the biggest exposure, because that's where it's hardest to plan for a response. A medical incident anywhere in the world we could probably sort now with our phone. It's pretty easy to Google a local hospital. But trying to sort of mitigate and deal with a crisis somewhere in a remote part of Africa, a security threat in Paris, for example, that's where actually the liability jumps up, because it's harder to sort of plan for and mitigate, and that's what we see people. And I guess it comes back to the second point, is that employee buy-in's a really big thing, and also risk perception across a company is always different.
Yeah.
You know, you've got the sort of the corporate hierarchy sat in their ivory tower, and they see a slight bit of insurrection in Egypt, or there's some bad guys
Yes.
in Mali, and they think, oh my God, we've got to get all our employees out. But then you've got the sort of the gold miner on site, the expatriate, who's like, I'm not leaving.
Yeah.
I make a fortune per day digging out gold. I'm not going anywhere. So that's also quite a hard thing to, I guess, get agreement across a corporate about.
And I think this risk point is kind of a nice sort of segue into the next question I was going to ask. And I'll start with you again, Richard. There's a bit of a feed line for you, really, which is, given that we've established that the safety conversation's changed, what are the things that need to change in global travel safety now?
The biggest thing is, and the hardest thing I think for travel managers, is actually getting employee buy-in for it. You know, you've basically there was an article published Business Travel News which said 50% of employees didn't know their companies had a corporate travel policy and a corporate booking policy. So that in itself is a huge issue to get the empowerment around. And then again, you've got a lot of people, as we talked about earlier, the seasoned travellers, who, oh, it's not going to happen to me. You know, I've been to Paris 400 times. I go 3 times a week. It never happens to me. Suddenly it happens to them, and these are the people that actually panic worse because they've really sort of been sat so much in their comfort zone. So I guess employee buy-in is one of the hardest things to face. You know, you can have the most fantastic travel booking system, but if your employees are going outside of that and booking their own travel and trips, then actually there's no way you can fulfill your duty of care because you've got no idea where they are.
Yeah.
So I guess from our perspective, it would be employee buy-in is a change that needs to happen, but is the hardest because people always push back. People hate change.
And I think I'm going to ask that same question of you, Clive.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. It's one I have a bit of an opinion on, in that I kind of see it as the way that we view security and risk as a negative, and we need to change it to a positive negative. So what I mean by that is that we sell it on fear, and people switch off around that because I think to that point, I'm a big boy, I know what I'm doing. And if you engage in a more positive manner around the policy and the way that you engage around it, and I'm not belittling it in any way, but there are opportunities here with the generations that you're dealing with around gamification, it's around engagement, even putting an element of a competition amongst employees about who's the most risk aware. I don't know, but I think there needs to be a change. Travel policies, and I can't speak for the larger organisations, drive me mad because they're so dry. Travel is still emotional, it should still be fun, it should be engaging, it's a privilege. So why don't you write the language of your travel policy in your audience? Now, that may mean that you have a travel policy for your engineers who are all under 25 that's written in a very modern, contemporary way to your C-suite who have something more traditional. You know, everything else in life, we gauge to the market that we have. Travel policies are gauged for people of my age who are nearing the end of their time of travelling, it's been a long day. But I want to make a travel policy fun to read. And there's one company we work with who worked with us to do it, and it's not for everybody. I get it, but suddenly we got it's a very young company with the average age of the traveller. First thing we do is check the DNA of the company about what the age and the gender of the travellers are, and then get them involved in writing it, and then make videos around it and put it online and get the engagement through it, and they became part of it, and it worked for that company, and it was like a hallelujah moment for me. It was somebody that actually created something that was telling the whole risk and guiding them to where they should go for a travel policy, but none of them felt like that it was about risk. It was a positive experience, and that works in certainly the more of the smaller companies. And I think we have to change the view of stop selling it as being, if you go there, you're going to die, because that is a pretty difficult message. It's about, how do you go there, have fun, and avoid dying. That's a better way of looking at it.
So what we're looking at here is what needs to change in global safety. And Caroline, I think these are linked points, right? Employee engagement and the emotional connection. And you've talked quite a bit about larger clients. Is that something which resonates with you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm sitting nodding away listening to both of you. I think there's some very basic, simple things that you can do, because at the end of the day, this is all just about influencing people to think differently, act differently. So some of the companies we've worked with, they've worked with their corporate card provider, and the plastic gets printed differently, and it has the safety and security provider's number on the corporate card, because it's the one thing that every single traveller has either their corporate card or their passport. Now, you can't get access to everyone's passports to print a page in there, but you have control of the piece of plastic that they pay with. Or if you're not a big enough customer to get the card provider to do that for you, then as you issue the corporate card, you issue the safety and security provider's card, so it's all wallet size. So you've got, immediately there's a message there, we're going to pay for you and we're going to look after you.
Yeah.
Really simple message, and very much like what Clive's done there. I love that, it's a great example. And then there are other things that you can do, I think, with like every time you're messaging travel, or every time your executives are maybe doing a town hall, you bring examples of what the key cost messages or employee value messages are. So one example of that we had recently, as we were interviewing the executives in the company, we're interviewing them because we want to know what they want for the business, but of course they can't help themselves but tell you their traveller stories. So what is booked as a 30-minute meeting always ends up as an hour. I've learned that one now. I always space out the interviews through the day. But what I found really interesting with one company we worked with is that they had these almost rock star travel stories that each supported what we wanted to get across as the messaging in the company. So I said to all of these execs, why don't you just become the poster children of what you're trying to achieve? Yeah. And you've each got a story, so when you're up on stage in a town hall, or you're writing in a communication or whatever, or you're having drinks with employees very informally, drop in that story because it's brilliant and it really supports everything that you're trying to do with your program. 6 months later, they've had this really subtle shift in how the employees feel about travel. So I think there's some sort of industrialised things you can do, which are very much look at which points you've got whereby you can influence people. It's a very sort of Six Sigma DMAIC kind of like approach to influencing, or there's a softer way of doing it as well.
Thank you very much for that, Caroline. And Adrian, sort of from the supply side, if you like, from the TMC side of the community, and I think just revisiting the question, you know, what are the things that we need to change now? We've talked a lot about employee engagement and the emotional connection, and how executives can lead some of that sort of change. What about from the TMC perspective?
Well, I think Clive spoke very well from the TMC perspective in terms of what they've achieved with one client. It would be great to have far more clients in that sort of space that wanted to communicate policy in that way. I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a lot of, most businesses will have a policy of some sort. What type of policy it is depends on the business they're in and where they are in the size and, you know, what they can afford and what they can't afford in terms of what that policy is. Communication of the policy is obviously a huge issue. I would think there's a part of a policy that I'm not too sure, you might come across this more than we would come across this from a TMC perspective, but the policy is written and communicated in whatever way it is, and there's always it's always to you will, you won't, you must, you have. I'm not too sure what the policy is internally if something goes wrong. That's the bit that I don't know whether in risk and within a corporation that has the communication that goes all this way towards the traveller, and some will have fantastic intranet, some won't, some will have e-learning, some won't, some will do, you know, produce the cars, some won't. But how many of them actually have the internal disaster recovery part of the policy that says, so if it does happen, what do we do as a business? And that's the bit that I would be interested in if I was employed in one of these companies, to say, I am travelling a lot, I do go to these areas, I'm pretty sensible, I'll toe the line, I'll do what's in policy, but if something goes wrong, what are we doing about it as a business? That's where you must come in, really.
Caroline, I have experience as well, is that people aren't educated enough about it. You know, they know how to go on their trip, but 9 times out, well, it's slightly unfair, but a lot of the time people don't really know what they should be doing if a problem occurs. But more importantly, something I've seen is that most of the time the C-suite have got absolutely no idea what they should be doing if a problem occurs. A big part of what we do, and the hardest thing to do, because it's really hard to obviously pin down directors, C-suites to actually be present in a meeting, is that you actually need to have proper crisis training. You know, you as a company, such simple things like if a problem occurs, who can authorise a company such as us to respond? So who says please proceed? What's your monetary sign-off? You know, oh, 20k, that's not enough. So if we need 100k, who has to sign us off? And that sort of thing is actually, a lot of companies we've dealt with don't really have anything in place, certainly at the outset. Um,
I'm glad I was right.
yeah, well, more was coming. It's an interesting area of exposure, actually.
I was coming back to just a quick story. As a TMC, when I had previous life within the TMC, and I'm sure the guys here within the TMC, there's a lot of providers in this sort of space as well that we work with very closely as TMC community. And I had one come in when we were looking at a product range and presented to us from a very big risk management type business, and he told us the story of the business he'd been to the morning before. Huge company. He'd gone in at board level and he talked about safety, security, risk, and why that company should obviously buy off his company the products that they could offer and the support that they could give. And he said, you know, he could see in the CEO's eyes that this was something that really resonated with the CEO. And he asked the CEO some very pertinent questions based on their policy and what their risk management, crisis management was. And he said, well, I gave it the HR director to sort, so who owns the policy. And the HR director said, well, I discussed it with the CIO. And the CIO said, and I went to the CFO and he took it out of the budget. And he said, I walked away, he said, with a huge contract because the CEO said nobody in that room owned the policy.
Yeah.
So
People
he had to put his hand up.
People
and say,
don't know
"I'll
about
own
it. We got
Yeah.
contacted
Yeah.
today for a medical evacuation by a company saying, an office in Qatar saying, oh, can you help? We've got X, Y, Z. You know, I know you do emergency evacuations. Can you assist? It was like, you already contracted to us. Oh, really? Like, yeah. Your head office already signed a contract with us. So there's information dissemination, I think, is quite poor.
We see like 3 levels, so when we work with clients, we assess where they are and then we tell them what great looks like and how they can get there. So we see the basic is that you track your travellers. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, but most companies now have got, medium to big, have got some kind of tracking solution in place. The next level up from that is that it's all integrated into your travel policy, your TMC know all about it, you can't turn left or right really without the traveller knowing what they should do, but that's still not enough. What we say is best practice, and we've seen this in some really successful big companies, is drilling situations. So I've done an exercise with a client where at 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, we drill Heathrow Airport closes and it closes for 4 days. And imagine all of the stuff that goes with that, right? There's no loss of life, there's no loss of brand impact or regulatory risk, all of that stuff that actually would make it big enough to go to the board, but there's a productivity impact and your people can't travel and all of that. The execs don't know it's coming, the travel team don't know it's coming. It's hilarious the first time you do it because it's headless chickens, right? Yeah. People really don't know who's doing what and da-da-da. But you do it to help show, right, we've done it this way and we've made it painful because it's the quickest way to learn, right? Fail fast. So then you build out, right, okay, this is now our disruption response. And then you get to the point where you go, okay, what's the difference between a disruption and a crisis? And we have this like really simple yes/no model, but for each company it's different. It's normally stuff like, is it loss of life? Is it loss of a major asset? An asset could be a building or something else. Is there a brand issue in that the underground bomb was in an Audi bag? Was it Audi or Lidl? I don't remember. Yeah. So that was a brand issue for them. Immediately pull together what we can do to protect the brand. So there's different, or it might be a regulatory issue and you're going to lose your license to operate as a pharma company or something. So you're very clear about if it ends up on that side, bloody hell, it's serious. And you know what? It's not the travel team that deal with it when it's over that side. There might be an airline involved or a hotel involved or a ground transport provider, but it absolutely must be your security, your risk, your board, like that. There's like levels to which you need to involve people.
Yeah, so I'm aware you're getting signals, and we're gonna have to move on.
No,
but there's one thing. There's one thing that. Yeah, I mean, there's one thing I probably want to. I'd like to add because it's something that's very close to my heart, and prior to getting there, there's an implicit assumption. Again, we implicitly assume that there was a universal definition and understanding of risk. I think there's also an implicit in the way that we build programs assumption that the threat comes from the outside. Yeah. The threat isn't actually coming from the traveler themselves. And I don't know how many people have seen a certain individual be freed from a jail in Dubai. One of the key things that I've, having especially worked a lot in the Middle East, is that there is this thing that when we go on travel, we're actually still kind of at home. A lot of the behaviors that we exhibit and things that we do are still permissible in that new environment and are not necessarily, or not as acceptable. What we'd get a slap on the hand for a wrist over here, we might end up doing 15 years elsewhere. And I think that's the threat is not always from without. The threat can be from within. And so that thing that I feel passionate about is that cultural awareness, and that thing is the thing that seems to be missing. Now, a lot of people say, okay, well, you know, we do that, for example, if we relocate someone, we'll put them on a cultural awareness thing. It's very difficult, takes 2 days, we can't do that, it's very complicated. And back to making it simple. Examples of how that could be made simple is by working with suppliers who help you. About 10 years ago, I went to a wedding, and I went to Durban in South Africa. And as I arrived in the hotel, I received a checklist. And that checklist said, if you're going to rent a car, or drive a car, make sure that your windows are up after 9 o'clock. Do not stop at any stop lights, even if it's red at this point in time, you know, and so on and so forth. So there was a small checklist.
Delightful.
Yeah, it was absolutely. I haven't been back to South Africa, but what I will say is, similarly, when we go onto a plane, there's a plane safety checklist. Why can't there be a simple checklist for the destination that you're going to land in? Yeah. Saying, you know, are you aware of that? And so can we not make this cultural awareness and these things more pervasive throughout the supply chain? For example, for your good selves, when you land in that country, here's an idea, trademark, everything. But why can't there be a little something in the front pocket that says that you are now in Qatar, yeah. Right? These are accepted behaviors, these aren't. Just to help the traveler, because the threat is not always from the outside. Yeah, yeah. The threat can come from the traveler in terms of, you know, they end up in jail, or they end up doing something that they consider normal in their own environment. And I think that's only augmented by global brands. You know, you see a Starbucks, all of a sudden you start recognizing signals. You're getting, signals that says this place is the same as home, and it's not. Yeah. It's not necessarily the same as home. It's that cultural awareness.
That's a really good point. Thank you for that. And I think that we've actually had a conversation here where we've aligned on some very common themes around global safety and how things need to change. I would love to open it up to the audience now, and I'm very, very keen, as we have you here, and we've been discussing this in some detail, to get some other perspectives and some questions from the audience for the panel. So I think now's the time, if we can, to open up to some broader questions. I think if anybody's got anything to ask of the panel generally, or of any individual who's here.
I only take easy questions. That's really important to state.
Well, can we wait for the microphone, if that's okay?
I don't necessarily need it. Hi, I'm Sam Candy from Business Travel Show. We're all in this room. I think most of us are not millennials, I have to say. Maybe some. Sorry.
How many people have you just insulted?
Yeah. But obviously, times are changing, and we need to communicate to millennials, and you obviously touched on it earlier. But how are we going to do that? Because they're a bit more gung-ho about how they travel, and they want to put a bit of pleasure in. How do you think that you're going to be able to communicate to people that are just like, hey, I'm going out there, I'm going to have fun?
So, Caroline, I'm going to direct that first answer to you, if I may. You've talked about a couple of clients who have a very high proportion of millennials working for them. So
yes.
You may well have
one of our gaming clients, actually, their average age is 25, and the absolute majority of their employees is below 30. So, you know, right bang in that millennial group. The way they communicate to them, when we first started working them, their 32-page policy, it's now 1 page. It's all done in gaming language. It's all done in their colours. We did gaming videos. So everything completely is done. But we didn't just assume, because we were a bunch of Gen X's in the room, so we didn't assume that we knew how they wanted to receive information. So we did a lot of listening with them, first of all. And we did get a lot of there is completely dull, like I'd never even seen that document, why on earth would I read it? All the stuff you would fully expect them to. But I would argue, as a Gen X, I don't want to read a 32-page document either. So I'm a little anti bucketing people by generations, because I think we should all just be treated as individuals, and I call it Gen E, Generation Everyone. And that some people might like reading a long document, most people won't. But what I would say is I've been doing a lot of research on Generation Z, and yes, they're arriving in the workplace this year for the first time. 21 Gen Zs are 21, and yes, that does mean Gen As are coming next after that. And Gen Z, the cut-off point for a Gen Z is that they were born 6 years before 9/11. And the reason for that is because apparently at the age of 6, you become a lot more aware about the world around you other than just yourself.
Right.
I have twin 4-year-olds, and yes, they all know about it. It's all about them, right? It's never anything about anyone else. So from the age of 6, you would have known that 9/11 was a really bad something based on how everyone around you was reacting. And if you think of, how much our world has changed since 9/11, not wanting to get you all on a downer before we go for dinner, but really the world has significantly changed. Terrorism sadly has become very normal. So Gen Zs have only ever known terrorism. They haven't known a world without terrorism. Now you could argue we had Northern Ireland and stuff as we were growing up, but I think it's a far more prolific.
Yeah.
So the research centres, the thinking is that Gen Zs are going to be far more careful about how they travel than the millennials. Now we don't know because we haven't seen it, they're too young, right? That we don't have consumer data, employer data, voting data, we don't have any of that on Gen Z yet. But I come back to, my base position would always just be ask people, like listen to them, because you may well find, even if you've got a majority of people under 30, that there are still 3 camps of people, or 5 camps, or 10 camps.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. A great question. I'd love to take another question, I think, before we run out of time. So,
I'm the CEO of a group of companies. I've founded 3 businesses. I've employed over 280 people directly. My old investment firm, where we employed 180 people directly, of which 30 were travelling all the time, including myself, which I did with great joy. We put people in some interesting places around the world. I think there's a conception, there's an issue, which is the perception is that in the last 6 or 7 years, the threat has come to the West, and it was started with 9/11. We used to have terrorist issues internally, which was Northern Ireland, and even though our Prime Minister and members of Parliament, etc., were directly targeted during those times, the perception of this new, slightly less frequent issue is that it's much more terrifying and much more prolific, because we knew why the Northern Irish, the Irish were doing it. We don't know why these people are getting in a hire car and running over a bridge. We just don't know. We can't fathom it. And it's come to London, and it's come to New York last week, and it's come to Paris, etc. And therefore the threat is perceived bigger. And in fact, it's terrorist incidents where people are dying have fallen dramatically since the 90s. So it's just the if you like, the perception of it is it's right outside my front door, not in Islamabad or wherever else it goes off all the time. So when travelling, we have to take a bit more of a direct view as employers on how we approach it. As the CEO of a company, I am responsible for 280 people, their livelihoods and their well-being. The contingency should be that every crisis management company, I don't care if you're the CEO of Barclays or the CEO of a tiny corporation that's got international travel, they're the people that should authorise crisis situations. They should be updated regardless. If you've got a 10,000 organisation and one of your employees has been arrested in Qatar, the CEO of that company, as Barclays or whatever else, should be notified straight away, and they should be given live feedback back.
Thank you very much. And I think Rob, that summarises quite a lot of discussion very well. So thank you for that. I'm very, very keen that we get on and have some dinner and actually further conversations. So we're going to spend some more time together. The panellists are joining us for dialogue. So thank you very much. Thanks particularly for that final point. And I'd like to thank the panellists, if we can, as a team. Thank you very much. And if I may ask you to join us next door, and we'll get on with some dinner, that'd be great. Thank you.